When you think of the United Nations, you probably picture diplomats in suits arguing in New York. But what if I told you that's just the tip of the iceberg? What if I told you that the UN is also this, and this, and this? Through UNICEF and the World Health Organization, the United Nations helps vaccinate nearly half of the world's children. Through the World Food Program, it provides food to nearly 100 million people every day. And through various relief agencies like the UNHCR and UNRWA, it assists tens of millions of people fleeing war and persecution. So, how does an organization famous for political gridlock also run the largest humanitarian operation on the planet? To understand the UN, we have to look beyond the Security Council and to the vast machinery that works every single day far from the headlines. The United Nations was born out of the ashes of the Second World War. In 1945, world leaders had just witnessed two global conflicts in the span of a single generation, wars that killed tens of millions, devastated economies, and left entire societies in ruin. Many feared that without a new system of cooperation, another catastrophic war was inevitable. But the United Nations wasn't the first attempt at a global organization. After World War I, states created the League of Nations, an ambitious experiment in collective security. But the League collapsed in the 1930s, unable to prevent aggression by powerful states like Germany, Italy, and Japan. That failure left a deep impression on the architects of the post-war order. They knew that if an international organization was to succeed, it would have to be both more inclusive and more realistic about power. The result was the United Nations, formally established in October 1945, when 51 countries ratified the UN Charter. The Charter laid out the organization's core purposes: to maintain international peace and security, to promote and protect human rights, to foster economic and social development, to uphold international law, and to provide a forum where states could meet and negotiate peacefully. But to achieve these goals, the Charter is built on a grand bargain. On the one hand, it enshrines the principle of sovereign equality, the idea that every member state, big or small, has legal equality within the system. On the other hand, it establishes the principle of collective security, that aggression against one state is a matter of concern for all, and that the United Nations has a role to play in preventing or responding to threats to peace. This bargain, giving up some autonomy in exchange for security, is at the heart of the UN system. But the UN was also a compromise. To prevent the mistakes of the League of Nations, the great powers insisted on special privileges, especially within the Security Council. The five victorious powers of World War II, the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China, were given permanent seats and veto power. This ensured they would stay engaged in the organization, but it also locked in an unequal power structure that remains controversial even today. In short, the UN was founded on both idealism and realism, the idea of building a more peaceful, cooperative world, and the realist recognition that the system would only work if the most powerful states agreed to play along. To understand how the UN works and why it sometimes doesn't, we need to look at its structure. The United Nations is made up of 6 main organs, each with different roles in global governance. Let's start with the most visible, the General Assembly. This is sometimes called the Parliament of the World. All 193 member states have a seat, and each state gets one vote, no matter how big or how small. This means that the United States and Tuvalu, a Pacific island with 11,000 people, are formally equals in this chamber. The General Assembly debates issues, passes resolutions, and approves the UN budget. Its great strength is legitimacy. Everyone gets a voice. But its weakness is that most resolutions are non-binding. They carry moral and political weight, but they can't force states to comply. While GA resolutions can be passed by a simple majority vote, the Assembly often works by consensus, since decisions reached unanimously carry greater political weight. The Security Council is the UN's most powerful body, charged with maintaining international peace and security. It has 15 members, 10 elected on a regional basis to rotating 2-year terms, and 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. These P5 members hold veto power, meaning any one of them can block a resolution even if all the other countries agree. This veto reflects the political realities of 1945. The great powers would only join the UN if they were guaranteed special privileges. But it also means that the Council often struggles to act when those powers disagree, as we've seen in cases from Syria to Ukraine and elsewhere. The Security Council is unique among UN bodies in that it has the ability to make binding decisions under Chapter 7 of the Charter, imposing sanctions and even authorizing the use of force, but enforcement still depends on the will of the member states. The Secretariat is the United Nations administrative arm, responsible for carrying out day-to-day operations and implementing the decisions of the General Assembly and the Security Council. At its head is the Secretary General, who serves as the UN's chief diplomat and moral voice. Some Secretaries General, like Dag Hammarskjöld or Kofi Annan, use the role to advocate boldly for peace or reform. Others have been more constrained by politics. The current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has made climate change and humanitarian crises central to his agenda. Located in The Hague, the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, settles legal disputes between states and gives advisory opinions on questions of international law. Its rulings are binding, but it has no enforcement power, and states have to accept its jurisdiction voluntarily. For example, the ICJ has ruled on maritime boundary disputes between countries like Nicaragua and Colombia, but compliance depends entirely on whether those states choose to abide by the judgment. Compliance, in other words, often relies on a state's desire to be seen as a legitimate actor and respect the rule of law, and the diplomatic pressure exerted by other nations. Next is ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. This body coordinates the UN's work on economic, social, and humanitarian issues. It serves as a bridge between member states and the UN's specialized agencies like the World Health Organization, UNESCO, or the International Labor Organization. ECOSOC provides one of the main entry points for non-governmental organizations and civil society groups to engage with the UN system. Finally, the Trusteeship Council was originally designed to oversee the transition of colonies and territories to independence. With the last trust territory, Palau, achieving independence in 1994, the Trusteeship Council has essentially completed its work. Today it meets only occasionally, a reminder of the UN's historical role in decolonization. Together, these 6 organs form the backbone of the UN system, but the UN family extends even further through dozens of specialized agencies and programs like UNICEF, the World Food Program, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and many, many more. For many people, this is the face of the UN they know best, providing food, medicine, shelter, and development aid around the world. So, while the Security Council may grab the headlines, it's often these humanitarian and development agencies that make the most direct impact on people's lives. Despite its many flaws, the United Nations has a long record of important achievements. Some are visible in headlines, others are so deeply woven into daily life that we often take them for granted. The UN has played a central role in helping to resolve conflicts. Since the end of the Cold War, UN peacekeeping missions have helped countries like Namibia, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Liberia transition from war to peace. In Namibia, for example, United Nations peacekeepers oversaw the country's first democratic elections in 1989, paving the way for independence after decades of conflict. They're not perfect stories, but they're real cases where the UN helped prevent a return to war. Through its specialized agencies, the UN has delivered life-saving assistance on a global scale. UNICEF has helped cut child mortality rates dramatically. The World Food Program feeds over 100 million people every year. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees provides shelter and protection for more than 30 million displaced people worldwide. These programs may not make the evening news, but they save lives every day. One of the UN's proudest achievements came through the World Health Organization, the global eradication of smallpox in 1980. This was the result of a coordinated international vaccination campaign, an achievement only possible through multilateral cooperation. More recently, the WHO has led international efforts to fight polio, Ebola, and, of course, COVID-19. Beyond national assistance, the UN helps create the rules of the game in international politics. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 set out a common standard of dignity and rights for all people, even if it's unevenly respected. More recently, initiatives like the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P doctrine, have sought to redefine sovereignty to include protecting populations from mass atrocities. Remember that the responsibility to protect is not a legally binding treaty, but a political norm, an attempt to redefine sovereignty to include protection of populations from mass atrocities. This is an important reason why its application has been so political and often so inconsistent. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals represent a global agenda for tackling poverty, inequality, and climate change. Finally, the UN was instrumental in supporting a wave of decolonization after World War II. More than 80 former colonies have gained independence with UN support, fundamentally reshaping the international system into the nearly 200 sovereign states we recognize today. These successes don't erase the UN's many shortcomings, but they do remind us that, at its best, the UN can save lives, foster peace, and articulate global norms that guide the behavior of states. Of course, the UN has also faced sharp criticism, and for good reason. For every success story, there are failures, blind spots, or contradictions. While the UN has had peacekeeping successes, it's also provided over some of the most tragic failures in modern history. In 1994, UN peacekeepers in Rwanda stood by as nearly 1 million people were killed in just 100 days. A year later, in Srebrenica, Bosnia, UN forces failed to protect civilians from massacre. And more recently, the Security Council has been paralyzed over Syria and Ukraine, unable to act decisively because of great power vetoes. These episodes highlight the UN's dependence on political will and the limits of collective security when powerful states disagree. Agencies like UNICEF and the World Food Program do life-saving work, but they rely on voluntary contributions from member states. That means their funding is unpredictable and often politicized. The result is chronic shortfalls. UN appeals are frequently underfunded, leaving millions without adequate assistance. Critics also argue that UN development can be top-down, slow-moving, and sometimes shaped more by donor priorities than by the needs of recipient communities. The World Health Organization has had important achievements, but it's also faced criticism for how slow and uneven its responses can be. During the early stages of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014 to 2016, the WHO was widely faulted for reacting too slowly. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed further weaknesses. Political pressure, inconsistent messaging, and reliance on states for transparency undermined the organization's credibility. These episodes illustrate the challenge of depending on member states for both information and authority. The UN has been central in setting global norms, but enforcement is another matter. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains more an aspiration than a reality in many parts of the world. Initiatives like the responsibility to protect have been applied inconsistently, evoked in Libya but ignored in Syria. Critics argue that norms promoted by the UN are often selectively applied and sometimes provide cover for great power interests. And while the UN helped dismantle formal colonialism, critics point out that its power structures still reflect 1945, not today's world. The Security Council's permanent members are the victors of World War II, not a reflection of 21st century balance of power. African, Latin American, and South Asian states, representing the majority of the world's population, remain excluded from permanent membership. Many argue that this undermines the UN's legitimacy, making it look like an institution run by and for a few great powers. In short, the UN is both indispensable and deeply flawed. It can save lives and set global agendas, but it can also fail catastrophically when political will is absent or power politics prevail. So, what does all of this tell us about the United Nations in the bigger picture of global governance? First, the UN is not a world government, and it was never designed to be. Instead, it functions as a hub, a meeting place, a coordination mechanism, and a source of legitimacy for collective action. When countries want to act together, whether on peace, health, development, or climate, they often turn to the UN to provide a framework. In this sense, the UN is central to global governance. It sets agendas, provides forums for negotiations, and helps establish norms that guide state behavior. Even though its decisions are often not binding, they carry symbolic and political weight. A Security Council resolution or even a General Assembly vote signals where the international community stands, and in diplomacy, that matters. But the UN is also limited. Its ability to act depends on the sovereign states that make it up, especially the most powerful ones. That means its effectiveness often rises or falls with the level of political will. It also means that the UN reflects global inequalities. The Security Council privileges a handful of states, while much of the global south feels marginalized. In other words, the UN embodies both the promise and the contradictions of global governance. It shows how far states are willing to cooperate and just how much they still guard their sovereignty. It demonstrates the potential of multilateralism, but also the ways that power politics shape and sometimes undermine it. So, when we study the UN, we're really studying the politics and the possibilities, as well as the limits of global governance itself, how humanity tries to manage shared challenges without a single global authority. The United Nations is both indispensable and imperfect. It saves lives, fosters cooperation, and builds the norms of our global system. But it's also failed in moments of crisis, reflects old power hierarchies, and too often has been paralyzed by politics. Former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld once said, "The United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell." That's a reminder that the UN was never meant to be utopian. It was designed to keep the world from sliding into chaos, to prevent the worst, even if it can't deliver the best. In that sense, the UN embodies the core dilemma of global governance. How do we manage global problems in a world without a central government? It's a messy, chaotic, political, and often frustrating process, but it remains one of the best tools we have. In our next video, we'll take a closer look at one of the UN's most distinctive and controversial tools for peace, peacekeeping operations. We'll examine how they work, where they succeed, and why they've sometimes failed so catastrophically. I'll see you there.